Hi, class. We're going to take a look at the paleo diet. Now, there's two ways that we can look at this. Let's just draw a couple of lines here. Of course, you've heard of the paleo diet as in the fad diet, which is based actually on the work of a nutritionist, Cordain. We'll talk a little bit more about that in this lecture. In addition to the type of a fad diet, that paleo diet, there's also an idea of the Paleolithic diet, or the type of food and dietary patterns that our ancestors engaged in a number of different periods. So here, let's start off with the Pliocene. I'll try and arrow all the way down. And just by way of review, we said that the Pliocene was 5 million years to approximately 2.5 million years ago, and this time frame, or this geological epoch, saw the Australopithecines, and also Homo habilis. As for the Pleistocene, we had pointed out that the Pleistocene was from 2.5 million years to approximately 0.02 million years ago, or if we translate that, that's 20,000 years ago. Why BP? Well, because. And then obviously we go into the Neolithic Revolution that took place in the Holocene, so that's where we're going to find our modern dietary behavior and what's becoming increasingly referred to as the Anthropocene. As for the Pleistocene, it's here where we have the emergence of Homo erectus, right? And then we also have the Neanderthals. And of course, us, Homo sapiens, and of course we're a subspecies. Now we've got our Homo sapiens sapiens. So like I said, what we're going to be interested in is the type of diet that we saw among the Australopithecines. We'll look at some of that evidence, the dietary changes that take place with Homo habilis, and of course, the remaining of the hominids. Let's move along. Okay, let's do a little bit of work here on our blackboard. And let's start off with a few species, the Australopithecines, and we know that they led to Homo habilis. We're using the splitter model, and of course Homo erectus. Now, one of the things that we note morphologically with respect to brain size or cranial capacity, the brain of the Australopithecine is approximately 390 milliliters. Homo habilis, we're looking at around 600 milliliters. And Homo erectus, we see a drastic increase, around 950 mils. And brain size continues to increase after this. So we pose the question, really, how do we explain, how do we explain the changes, how do we explain the changes in brain size? Right? Is it environmental? What's going on here? What's taking place? So the Australopithecines, interestingly, what we know about them, and we'll take a look at a little bit of their dietary pattern. They eat plants, they eat nuts, they're eating seeds. Of course, they're probably going to eat insects. In addition to that, they're going to be eating grass, bark. Okay, that's pretty much their diet. Homo habilis, we have correlated, or we've causally connected Homo habilis with tools. And those tools, the function and the purpose of those tools represent a shift in the dietary pattern. They're eating meat. And with Homo erectus, we see the further development of tools. They're eating meat, and they're doing so intensively. So they're eating lots of meat. in addition to a varied diet. So just because they're eating meat doesn't mean that they're not eating plants, nuts, seeds, fruit. All of that stuff is going to continue, but the main difference we're seeing is the incorporation of meat into these diets. Now, Homo habilis, it's not. So sometimes we use a symbol for approximately or not in formal logic. So it's not a hunter. Okay. We're going to explore this a little bit further, but important things to keep in mind is what we're seeing here is a dietary change that's correlated with change in cranial capacity over time. Now, I had pointed out that Homo habilis was not a hunter. And one of the questions we always should have is, how do you know that? Where does that information come from? So what I had referred to it as was a tertiary scavenger. In other words, a third-party scavenger, something that came along after the fact and ultimately appropriated the rest of the resources that remained on the carcass. How do we get at that information? If we look at the right of the screen, what we see are a number of cut marks. Now, under microscopic analysis, what we understand about these cut marks is they're on top of tooth marks. So that tells us that another animal first scavenged this animal, may be responsible for killing it. It consumed the meat that it was interested in eating. Once it had enough, it left. And along came, for example, Homo habilis, maybe scared away the vultures that were there, and it continued to render the meat on this particular carcass. So a few points. We've got cut marks, and they overlie animal tooth marks. So that tells us that Homo habilis was not the individual that was responsible for killing this particular animal. The other thing that we see with respect to Homo habilis is that increase in brain size. And here I want to make that formal connection to a change in diet, that behavioral change, and the impact that it had upon the brain of Homo habilis. As a result of these changes in brain size, eventually we see new cultural adaptations, and we continue to have the process of that cultural evolution over time. Now, all of this stuff, it created a more successful species. And when we're thinking of evolution, we always have to put it into that reproductive success framework. Is it allowing the species to reproduce more successfully? And if so, that species has a greater opportunity or greater chance of passing on these new genes or these new frequencies of alleles to its offspring. And over long periods of time, we get that evolution that we've been talking about, that macro evolution. As for other species, they began to engage in new behavioral strategies as well. Before we go on to that, let's just take a brief look at what was taking place with the stomach and the brain in these early hominins. So we've already looked at some of the evidence for this shift in the diet of our ancestors, which leads us to this idea of the paleo diet. I want to take a look at the impact that the paleo diet has on the brain, and I want to specifically discuss some of that evidence. With respect to evidence, we've already talked about Paleolithic tools, and that's provided us with evidence for a shift in diet. And we saw that beginning with Homo habilis. In addition to those Paleolithic tools, we saw refinement. So refinement of Paleolithic tools, I'll just do a drop down there. And also fire. And that's associated with Homo erectus. Now, one of the things that we should ask, and as I've tried to encourage, is anytime we do this type of discussion, the question is, well, how do you know? right? You know, this is one of the basic questions that we have is how do you know this? Well, with respect to tools, for example, before we go on, I'll give you some of this. We look for butcher sites, right? And we see that in the archaeological and paleoanthropological record. And we're able to date that through something that we've referred to potassium argon 40 dating those particular sites. And we're able to see that they're somewhere around, let's say, 2 million years of age. So that tells us that humans were butchering animals. The other thing is cut marks. So we can analyze the cut marks on bone, which are now fossil, and we can also match that to particular type of cutting implements. So this does give us that evidence that we need to say, yeah, the Homo species, Homo habilis and Homo erectus associated with these sites, they were definitely eating meat. But let's go a little bit further. How do you know that the Australopithecines, for example, Australopithecus anamensis, wasn't a meat eater? How do we get at that? So I want to discuss some of that here, and I want to do so fairly briefly. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Okay, let's move along. So let's take a look at the evidence, top right corner, for diet. And we're looking at our pre-Homo species. And that's really what we need to argue here. What we're looking at, this image, I'm going to highlight it for you. This is called microwear analysis. And what they're analyzing, so there's a highlighting, they're analyzing phytoliths. And the best way to describe a phytolith is perhaps with a direct translation. Phytolith means plant stone. And these minerals, plant stones, phytoliths, they have very particular signatures, and we can study the enamel of teeth microscopically. So that's what we're seeing here is a microscopic image of the dentition or the tooth enamel of Australopithecus afarensis. And what it tells us when we look at these individuals, we get good insight into the dietary pattern. Our early ancestors, they were primarily vegetation, perhaps meat from time to time. We see chimpanzees do that, but meat was not the main staple. Okay. Also, looking at something that's referred to as stable isotope analysis, we're able to see that these individuals, again, what they were consuming has the isotopes of plants that are high in carbon-3. So that would be grasses, referred to as sledges, for example, those tall grasses that we see. Perhaps my grass is a little thick there. But either way, you get the idea. We get these tall grasses. They're eating shrubs. They're also eating nuts, believe it or not, bark. That, by and large, is their diet. And they need to eat for a long time. As pointed out, if I haven't pointed out already, if we look at, for example, a gorilla, and a gorilla is larger than we are, but a gorilla, it requires approximately 9 hours of eating or subsistence behavior, 9 hours of eating per day in order to get enough nutrients from vegetation. So as pointed out, this is what we're after, was that evidence to say that yes, our pre-Homo species relied upon diets that were primarily vegetation, nuts, barks, grass, and shrubs. And that has an impact upon the size of the brain. It also has an impact upon the size of the stomach. And what we had referred to was this idea called the expensive tissue hypothesis. Now this slide highlights some of the differences between Australopithecus afarensis and, for example, Homo erectus. We would have also seen similar changes taking place with Homo habilis. Um, so the Australopithecines, as vegetarians, they had a larger or more complicated gastrointestinal system represented in the area that's been highlighted. In contrast, Homo erectus, it has a smaller gastrointestinal system, and you don't need that complex system to manage meat in the same way that you do vegetation. Now, the other point here, according to Wrangham, he's an anthropologist. He wrote a book called Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Human. He points out that the gut is actually a very expensive tissue. It takes a lot of energy to make that operate from a physiological or metabolic perspective. The same thing is true of a brain. A brain requires 33 times more energy than any other muscle in the body. So the logic goes, you can't have two expensive tissues. You can't have an expensive gut and an expensive brain. So as we started to go through this shift, as we began to change from a vegetarian diet to one that relied upon more meat rather than vegetation, the gut eventually changes over size. A smaller size, a less expensive gut is selected for. And as we begin to utilize protein, which is great for tissue, we're able to redirect that glucose to the brain, and that eventually causes this expansion in the hominin brain, and it increasingly gets larger over time. Now, the other component that we had pointed out, it wasn't simply that we're eating meat, that gives us protein, but raw meat can only provide so much protein. The next really big step, as Wrangham points out, is cooking, the use of fire. And we see that with Homo erectus, and that's why we see such a big difference again from Homo habilis to Homo erectus. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so this expensive tissue hypothesis, this is offered by an anthropologist by the name of Wrangham. Names can be important, and he argues that yes, the brain is an expensive organ. Well, how expensive is it? Looking at expense, it's done in two ways, and he says that for the brain to function, it requires about 22 times the metabolic energy of an equivalent muscle. Okay, so that sounds like a lot. What does that translate into calories? And how much, or as a percentage, calories does the brain require out of our total caloric intake during the day? He points out that the brain currently, and granted our brains are larger now, requires about 30% of our daily calories to support brain function. So he goes on to say that we traded this big gut, right? That big gut, I'm going to draw a line over here, which was a gut that was adapted to a vegetarian diet, for a big brain, which ultimately was the consequence of a diet that relied upon a lot of meat and proteins. Looking at cranial capacity, and again, that's the question, how do we know that this was taking place? Well, for example, if we take a look at here, Australopithecus africanus. Australopithecus africanus, its brain size, or its cranial capacity, is approximately 350 milliliters. So what? That's about the size of a can of Coca-Cola. That's about it. That's not a very big brain. In contrast, when we move to Homo habilis, we're seeing something very different take place. The cranial capacity of Homo habilis is approximately 600 milliliters. So I'm going to say what? That's about one and almost another full can of pop or beer, whatever you choose. Homo erectus, hopefully you're not choosing while we're studying, while you're at home, and I guess you can do that. You probably shouldn't. You've heard of, I hope, this idea. Let's take a break. Break time trivia. State dependency. So what the state dependency, while we're talking about the brain, what state dependency theory says in psychology is when you're going to recall information, you need to be in the same state you were when you learned that information. So if you were, for example, drinking coffee, you probably need coffee during your test to recall that information, or at least helps, because we are dealing with a chemical process. Is state dependency testable? No, it's not testable. Back to the content. We need a little break sometimes. Okay, so cranial capacity of Africanus, about a pop can, 350. Homo habilis, it's increased quite drastically. And if we think all the way back to Darwin, he pointed out that evolution was a slow, gradual process. Right? That's the way evolution takes place. And this is generally speaking true if we look at the Australopithecines. Their brain really doesn't increase probably about a teaspoon every 100,000 years. And then all of a sudden, we see 2.5 million years ago, and I'm just going to go right up on top of Homo habilis, 2.5 MYA, we get this massive jump in brain size. Darwin was partially correct, and I want to underscore this, that he wasn't wrong, but he didn't get it all. Stephen Jay Gould, he talks a little bit about evolution. He's an evolutionary biologist, the late Stephen Jay Gould, and he points out that sometimes evolution speeds up. And he referred to this as punctuated equilibrium theory. So yeah, that's what we're seeing here is evolution is speeding up. Homo erectus, this is where we see another great leap in cranial capacity. The cranial capacity of Homo erectus is approximately 900 milliliters. So we're increasing 2+ cans of pop. Homo sapiens neanderthaliensis was definitely a big meat eater. We see it in their bone stable isotope analysis. They primarily ate meat, and the brain really shows that. So I'm going to go all the way down here for cranial capacity. And we usually think of Neanderthals as a brute. Well, very large brains, 1450 mLs. As for Homo sapiens, sapiens us, our brains were quite big initially, around 1450 mLs when we emerged, except after the Neolithic Revolution, they actually shrink in size. About 10,000 years ago, our brains, when we started eating perhaps less meat and relying upon more grains, our brains get smaller, and we're in around, that's the average, around 1,250 milliliters. Okay, let's move along. All right, so a PhD in nutrition by the name of Cordain is responsible for looking at the 21st century diet and saying that there's a collision, and this is kind of a key idea of his work. He says there's a collision between our ancient genome and our current diet. I'm paraphrasing there. So there's this collision between our ancient genome and our diet, and our bodies really aren't prepared, or they're not well adapted. Probably better to say that bodies are not well adapted to the food / diet Okay, there you have it. There's really his idea in a nutshell. That's a peanut. Hope you're not allergic. Okay, so bodies are not well adapted to the food diet that we're currently consuming. Let's take a look at this and see what the evidence does in fact say, and whether or not there is anything to the paleo diet. We should always be looking or including evidence in anything that we do, especially essays or support, so point proof format. And here we're looking for support for this dramatic, so dramatic as he's put it, collision between an ancient genome, you know, that's going back 2.5 million years ago, for example. And that's arguable, very arguable, as I'm going to point out. And our current diet, which is referred to as the standard American diet, SAD, and we're getting this collision, boom. Okay, so how do we look at this? BMI, let's take a look at that. BMI is calculated by weight divided by height. An individual that is 1.8 meters, that is 190 pounds, for example, it's going to be overweight. If that individual gains 20 pounds, well, now they're obese. And I think we need to be cautious, because BMI isn't always the best indicator. I would ask, why? Why are we seeing an increase in weight? Well, perhaps the individual is exercising and putting a lot of muscle mass. Arnold Schwarzenegger-like muscle mass, or The Rock. I don't think we're going to call The Rock or Arnold Schwarzenegger overweight or obese. Muscle weighs heavier, is heavier than fat. Taking that into consideration, what we know is there has been an increase in the last number of decades, such that in Canada, for example, 70% of adults fit into the category of overweight and obese, and 33, approximately, all of these, approximately 33% of kids fit into that category of overweight and or obese. If we go back to the 1950s, we don't see that. We don't see it in the 1960s, this type of weight distribution. We don't even see it in the 1970s. And then all of a sudden people begin to increase in size, 1980s into the 90s and 2000s. What's happening? There has been a change in the way that we live. Ultimately, at one point of time, the anthropological symbols, for example, male and female. Okay, wrong symbol there. Male and female, and not to say that heterosexual marriage is the proper marriage, the monolithic marriage, but just because this is the reproductive family, biologically reproductive family, so male and female, they're married. They've got a couple of kids, let's say a little boy and a little girl. And historically, 1950s, it was dad that went to work and mom that stayed home. And as we progressed in time and we started to reach the 1980s, things started to change. And we have a woman's movement, the feminist movement, and the woman, the wife, she decided, and fortunately, a lot of husbands began to support this, and they said, yeah, this is a great idea. We need two people working to make ends meet. So as we began to move in through, or these decades, general patterns of familial behavior began to change, and Americans began to rely upon, and when I say Americans, I mean North Americans, the standard American diet. The standard American diet is based on food like bread, pasta, rice, bagels, fries. I think you're getting the idea here. Burgers and highly processed. Try and squeeze it in there. Highly processed foods. So as pointed out, we're seeing something take place. And it's not because people are going out and they're putting on a lot of muscle mass. Instead, we're seeing an increase in weight because of this standard American diet, which is high in a lot of glucose. And not only are we seeing individuals increase in weight, we're also seeing type 2 diabetes. And in fact, that's become an epidemic around the world. And between obesity and type 2 diabetes, this costs countries a lot of money. So we are seeing drastic changes. And I think the question is, we still need to come back to this. Did people historically, did their diet create a different type of body? What did they look like? Were they, in fact, healthier? Now, we're going to tackle that question. Okay, let's move along. Well, as for humans and the SAD diet, we're also seeing that raccoons, CBC News reports in 2018 that raccoons in urban areas are more likely to be hypoglycemic. In other words, we're seeing not only increased rates of diabetes among us, type 2, but we're also seeing it among the animals that consume our waste or garbage. And what are they eating? Standard American diet. So here's another kind of anecdotal connection. Let's move along. So in an effort to understand the paleo diet, let's go up here. We've looked at, for example, Paleolithic tools and the function of those tools. We'd pointed out that they were scrapers, they were choppers, and they were cutters. And this was ultimately designed to get at meat, and we see that beginning with the old Dewan tool tradition 2.5 million years ago. In addition to that, we've looked at ancient hearths, and in those ancient hearths we see charred remains. Now, the final thing that we can look at here, at least for our purposes here, and this isn't to suggest that any contemporary society is a living fossil, they're not, but we can look at living foragers, living subsistence. And try to get some insight from them. So get some insight into their diet. But more importantly, if we're going to connect this to Cordain, right? Because he said this new diet is a problem. If we want to make that connection to Cordain, we're going to also have to take a look at their health and see if there are any differences in comparison to us. Let's move to the next slide. The last subsistence foragers, and most societies now have changed from foraging to a more contemporary type of living, but we do have good documentation of how these individuals lived and what their health was like. So what we know, for example, the Hasda, and they're in Africa, Eastern Africa, midway. I'll highlight this if you're not seeing it. It's right over here. We have the Hasda. And the Hasda, they hunt small game, large game. In addition to that, they have berries that they regularly utilize. And maybe you're wondering how much meat. I'll click that in here as well. How much meat are they consuming? On average, these groups of individuals are consuming approximately 8 ounces per day. In addition to that, as pointed out, berries, tubers figure into their diet, a number of different fruits, plants, honey. So this is really what a type of subsistence foraging or optimal foraging looks like. This is what Christina Warner is talking about. So they're utilizing the resources that are available during particular seasons. And if we look at the health of these individuals, other point here as well I want to make, these individuals get on average about 11 kilometers per day of walking or running. So they are getting quite a bit of exercise, and they're taking in about 2,200 calories per day, which is enough living in a hot and vigorous lifestyle that they don't lose weight. So really that's kind of what's required. That's the marker there, even though we in Canada say you need about 26 to 2,800 calories. It's probably too much, at least judging from other societies, so they don't lose weight. We certainly don't see any individuals that are obese or obesity. That doesn't exist. Individuals are not overweight. As for type 2 diabetes, that doesn't exist either. I'm going to erase this because we're going to have some information coming up here. There we go. Diabetes, type 2, cardiovascular disease, they're non-existent in these societies. So this gives us some good insight into the epidemics of the 20th and 21st century. And we definitely want to connect that to diet and lifestyle. Now you might be thinking, aren't the rates of diabetes really high among the Inuit, for example, or First Nations? And what I'll point out is, yes, we are seeing that, but this is not a result of traditional diet. So we do see diabetes here currently, but this is because there's been a shift, a dietary shift, and a reliance upon a lot of food that is in fact very high in carbohydrates and glucose. Okay, let's move to the next slide. In this last slide, I want to be critical of both Cordain and Christina Warner. Christina Warner, number one. Okay, let's start off with her. Christina Warner, she's critical of the paleo diet, and I don't think for good reason. The evidence is there that we had a diet that relied a lot on or greatly upon meat, and instead of that paleo diet she wants to offer versus the optimal foraging model. And I think what's ironic about Warner's idea is she ultimately comes to the same conclusion as Cordain. She says that the standard American diet, it's unhealthy. And she says we need to cut out the grains, we need to cut out the processed foods, we need a reasonable amount of meat, we need vegetation, we need fruits, nuts, all of that stuff. And that's ultimately what Cordain says. So I think really what we're looking at is, I think she feels that Cordain, an individual in nutrition, is perhaps stepping on the toes of anthropology discussing the paleo diet. Now that doesn't mean that Cordain's absolutely correct either. Cordain, the problem I have with him is he talks about a collision between our ancient genome and a modern diet. I don't know, let's have a little explosion here, a collision between the two. All right, so we have this collision between our genome and the modern diet. And in offering this, Cordain says, we really haven't evolved. So we really haven't evolved for a modern diet. And I have a problem with that because he is implying this old model where evolution is a slow and gradual process. Okay, so that's his idea of evolution, is a slow and gradual process, and that's very much in line with Charles Darwin, but it's not in line with other thinkers that talk about punctuated equilibrium theory where evolution speeds up. And we know that sometimes evolution does speed up. So I'm going to say in contrast over here, I'm going to give you a contrast. I'll go underneath. So evolution does speed up. And I'm going to give you a couple examples. Number one, we're going to look at height. So pre-Neolithic, I'm just going to go short form here. Pre-Neolithic, we'll say approximately, let's say 18,000 years ago, 18,000 YBP. Humans on average and further back as well, so 18,000 YB plus. As we go into the past, males on average were about 6 feet in height. Once we get into the Neolithic Revolution, and granted this doesn't start immediately, but Jared Diamond, for example, he took a look at some of this. So we're going to say post Neolithic Revolution, and let's say approximately 8,000 YBP. Humans drop in height to approximately 5 feet, 6 inches for males. Okay, so here we have the symbol for male in anthropology and another symbol for male in anthropology. Triangle, we don't like to use the sign for Mars because, well, we're not from Mars. That doesn't make sense. Okay, so we're seeing a change, and now current or contemporary times, males on average, they're getting back to 6 feet in height. So this has a lot to do with nutrition as well, availability of nutrition, but also has a lot to do with genetics as well, because populations that have been traditionally short, they're getting taller. And that is genetic. In addition to that, post-Neolithic Revolution, our brains got smaller. That's something else that has taken place. In addition to that, and I want to go over here to diet because specifically they're talking about diet and evolution. Diet and evolution. There's been a change among a lot of individuals such that they produce a lot of copies of an enzyme that's referred to as AMY1. And this renders grains digestible. And especially those glutens. Some individuals, they have a lot of copies. Okay, so they have many copies of AMY1. Other individuals don't. So as the copies that you have of AMY1 goes up, grains are much more digestible. The other thing I want to talk about is a shift that took place. It began this revolution around 11,000 years before the present, and by about 6,500 years before the present, it was pretty much complete in a number of areas of the world. So in between that time frame, so we're going to say between 11,000 YBP and 65,100 YBP, 6,500 years before the present, another mutation emerges, what's referred to as the MC-M6, and this is why people can drink. Some people can drink raw milk, and some people can't. I'll catch you in the next segment, and we'll talk about the milk revolution. Take care.